We've seen that the difference between the Creator and creation is fundamental and can't be collapsed. God is not a part of the world, nor the sum total of the world. Some have perhaps understandably worried that this stress on divine transcendence might make God very remote and distant and unreachable. If the world is completely other than God, doesn't that make the world empty of God? However, creation out of nothing rightly understood does not have this consequence at all. In fact, quite the opposite. To see why that's the case, we need to grasp something important about God that Christian theologians throughout history have typically affirmed. We can think of God as the one whose essence is to be. And a biblical text that was very influential here was God's revelation to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. I am who I am. Or as the Greek translation, which is what many of the early Christians would have read, says, I am the one who is. God's very essence, the core of who or what God is to be, to exist. Creatures aren't like that. For any creature, there is a clear distinction between its nature and its existence, between what it is and that it is. For example, I'm a human being, that's what I am, and in addition, I exist. I am, but my existence isn't part of my nature. I didn't have to exist. Nothing at all about my human nature demands that I exist. With God, it's different. God's essence and God's existence are the same. Who God is and that God is cannot be distinguished. It is God's nature to exist. God is the one who is. And that means that God's existence isn't dependent on anyone or anything. God simply is. Created things are fundamentally different. We are dependent at each and every moment of our existence. We receive our being as a gift from God, and apart from that ongoing gift, we are literally nothing. Theologians often speak about creation sharing or participating in God, and by that they mean that God is granting being to creatures and thereby enabling them to share in their own distinctive ways in His being, His isness. The influence of God on things then isn't like the influence of created things on others. Imagine a billiard ball that hits another billiard ball and causes it to move. The one ball works as an outside force affecting the other one. But God's influence on creation isn't like that. God doesn't sustain creatures from the outside, but from within. God is the very cause of our being, which is inmost in all things. God works in all things intimately. And that's what theologians call divine immanence, God's closeness to and presence in all things. God is not at a distance from creation, on the other side of some unbridgeable chasm. God is present to everything, everywhere, always. Nothing exists outside the field of God's influence. As the psalmist puts it, where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be as night, even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. As St. Paul said to the Athenians, God isn't far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. God is the sea and we are the fish. More than that, we have our very being in him. By sharing in his being, that means that God is intimate to everything, in everything. God is thus interior to us. There's no actual distance between us and the Creator. And consequently, we could speak about the world as sacramental in its very structure. Any part of creation, in other words, has the potential to reveal some aspect of God. We simply need to have our eyes open to see. That's why the psalmist, when he looks up at the heavens, can see something of God. He said, the heavens declare the glory of God. Other poets have often revelled in this insight. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, for instance, writes, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes." And famously, Gerard Manley Hopkins, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil." Macrina Wiedeker writes, "You live in a world of theophanies. Holiness comes wrapped in the ordinary. There are burning bushes all around you. Every tree is full of angels. Hidden beauty is waiting in every crumb. Life wants to lead you from crumbs to angels. But this can happen only if you're willing to unwrap the ordinary by staying with it long enough to harvest its treasure." Another consequence of the doctrine of creation and of nothing is that we can't talk about any finite creature adequately without talking about God. Because no creature has an identity apart from its relation to God. Our very existence, our being, is a relation to God. And apart from that relation, we are literally nothing. This in turn means that no creature can ever be fully grasped and understood. Why? Because our being is a participation in God's infinite being. There is a depth to created things. They all open out into the bottomless depths of God. To understand anything fully is impossible, because nothing can be understood apart from its relation to God. And God's fullness cannot be known. As Michael Hamby comments, reality is bottomless because the heart of each thing is the mystery of being, and the heart of being is God. In sum, the Church refuses to affirm divine transcendence apart from divine immanence, because that leads to a God separated from creation, distant, indifferent, and inaccessible. It also limits God because it marks creation off as a God-free zone. But the Church also refuses to affirm divine immanence apart from divine transcendence, because that ends up collapsing creator and creation into each other. On that view, the world is God, and God is the world. But that too limits God to the finite sum of finite creatures. Instead, creation from nothing insists that God is both distinct from the world and that the world is saturated with God's presence. So in the next video, we'll look at the important implications of creatio ex nihilo for the way that we think about God's actions in creation.